Returning to 3 years ago, a pathway to another dimension, called gates, suddenly appeared, and within those gates existed creatures immune to conventional weapons. Those capable of fighting these creatures were called hunters. They were classified into ranks from S to E based on the amount of mana in their bodies. However, some hunters, despite their efforts, never saw their abilities develop. Fast forward to the present time, many hunters are gathering in front of a gate to prepare for a monster extermination expedition. Because being a hunter brings in a lot of money, some young men and even older folks have quit their jobs just to slay monsters. Shortly after, the protagonist of the story, named Sung Jin-woo, appeared to join them on the expedition. Seeing Jin-woo's skinny physique, the older folks had to ask if he was eating properly because, as they knew, Jin-woo was nicknamed the weakest hunter of mankind. Although this gate was only rank E, hunters like Jin-woo could still get seriously injured. Whenever Jin-woo was called upon, they always assumed this expedition was ranked at the lowest level. Among the hunters, the one who cares most about Jin-woo is a therapy girl named Ju-hee. Whenever Jin-woo got injured, Ju-hee always showed great concern for him. Jin-woo had been seriously injured in the recent dungeon breakthrough, but because the team consisted of strong people, no one acted as a healer, and Jin-woo was used to getting hurt anyway. At this moment, the leader of the dungeon breakthrough, named Song, appeared and led the group into the gate. Jin-woo was instructed to follow everyone else to avoid getting hurt. In reality, Jin-woo had very low income, so he could only afford to buy a cheap knife. Therefore, today Jin-woo had to motivate himself to try much harder. Meanwhile, the president of the Korean Hunter Association, named Go-gun, just had a meeting with the government. Although the government didn't want to publicize the story about the dungeon, they requested a stable supply of resources from the dungeons because the crystal stones dropped after defeating monsters were worth a lot of money. It was because of these stones that hunters like Jin-woo had to venture into dangerous dungeons to obtain them. Right now, Jin-woo was fighting a very fierce goblin. Even the only knife that Jin-woo brought along was broken, so he had to swallow a sword strike from it. Luckily, one of the older folks appeared just in time to kill that goblin to save Jin-woo. At the same time, he also instructed Ju-hee to quickly treat Jin-woo. Thanks to Ju-hee's healing magic, the wounds on Jin-woo's body were gradually healing. The other hunters were continuing the battle to eliminate the remaining monsters in the dungeon. According to President Go, the crystal stones dropped from high-level monsters could be transformed into stronger equipment for the hunters. Additionally, within the dungeon, there was a resource called mana ore, which the government intended to use as a new energy source. Mana ore was considered both powerful and clean. Currently, only new hunters could collect that resource, so they played a very important role for the government. Jin-woo's group successfully defeated the final bug of the dungeon, but Ju-hee still showed extreme concern for Jin-woo's condition. If he continued to get injured like this, something big might happen one day. Although Jin-woo usually only apologized, Ju-hee didn't need those words. She just wanted Jin-woo to be safe. Feeling that the trip was too hard and didn't yield much, Jin-woo almost lost his life but only gained the lowest ranked magic stone. Just then, someone in the group discovered an underground passage of the dungeon. Seeing that the dungeon had not yet closed, everyone thought there might be better prey inside. However, if reported to the Hunter Association, the group would lose the opportunity. Everyone in the group agreed to continue, but Ju-hee didn't want to. After consulting with everyone, the number of objections equaled the number of approvals. Now only Jin-woo's decision would be the group's decision. Jin-woo's situation was very difficult as his father had left, and his mother was hospitalized. Besides worrying about his mother's medical expenses, Jin-woo also had to worry about his sister's tuition. Therefore, Jin-woo needed a lot of money. He decided to continue. The Hunter Association was assessing the strength for new people. Just by touching the black crystal stone, each person's mana level would appear. Each person would be ranked according to the mana they obtained, and those with high ranks would approach the Hunter Association to sign recruitment contracts. The head of the Hunter Association was a guy named Choi Jan-Ian. According to Choi, in his association, there was a very strong S-rank female hunter named Cha Hein. Back to Jin Woo, his group was going deep into the cave. They had been walking for 40 minutes but had not encountered any monsters. Jin Woo felt guilty to Ju Hee for agreeing to continue, but Ju Hee didn't feel it was hard. She was just angry with Jin Woo for wanting to continue after almost losing his life. Jin Woo also agreed that if it weren't for Ju Hee's timely healing, he would have died already. Ju Hee said that if Jin Woo felt guilty, next time he should treat her when they went out to eat together. After walking for a while, the group arrived at a large room. Everyone agreed to move forward together. An old man opened the door to lead the entire group inside. Meanwhile, President Go was advising the newly awakened ones about their powers. There were still many mysteries in the dungeon that humanity had not discovered, so the hunters had to be careful. Even the cowardly ones had to keep their lives. Meanwhile, Jin Woo's raiding team opened the door and entered a large room. This was the first time they had seen a dungeon entirely filled with stone statues arranged around. In the center stood a gigantic stone statue that left Jin Woo in awe. Now, many were feeling uneasy as there were no monsters around, only a mysterious magic circle along with some ancient inscriptions on the statue. Suddenly, Due appeared very scared and had to stand closer. Jin Woo mentioned that the eyes of the giant statue had just moved as if observing the group. Right at that moment, the door to the room unexpectedly slammed shut, causing some in the group to start panicking. An old man decided he would go home, but as he reached the door, the statue suddenly swung its axe, causing him to perish on the spot. The appearance of someone being killed like this made the entire group start to panic. Jin Woo felt very afraid because in this group, he was the weakest hunter. Jin Woo couldn't believe that this was just a grade D dungeon to have such a terrifying monster. Even the entire statues were showing signs of movement, including the largest one staring directly at Jin Woo. Remembering the dangers he had faced before, Jin Woo felt anxious. Not only had he lost sight of everyone and been defeated by a group of E-rank monsters, but Jin Woo had also been hospitalized multiple times. His weapon was only a cheap knife, while other hunters had luxurious equipment. Every time they raided a dungeon, Jin Woo's knife would dull because he was too weak. Jin Woo was always looked down upon by the other hunters, but he still carefully observed his surroundings to find any openings to try to survive. When the statue attacked, Jin Woo shouted loudly for everyone to quickly lie down. However, someone unfortunate was turned to ash because Jin Woo had hugged Ju Hee, so the two of them remained safe. After observing the surroundings, Jin Woo understood that things were not over yet. People around didn't know whether to run or stay after witnessing two leaders being attacked. At this point, one person in the group, Jin-gu, couldn't bear it and wanted to run outside. Although he was a hunter with incredibly fast speed, he was attacked by the statue, causing him to stumble. Jin-gu thought that this monster could easily wipe out everyone. However, everyone felt very frightened and didn't know what to do next. Remembering the first rule on the stone tablet, which was to respect the deity, Jin Woo decided to take a risky move to see if his speculation was correct. Jin Woo stood up just as the statue gathered energy to attack, but when he knelt down, the statue stopped. Jin Woo then reminded everyone around to kneel down, as it seemed to be the rule to respect the deity. After hearing this, everyone knelt down on the ground. Although the eyes of the statue had changed, it suddenly cracked a terrifying smile. Seeing that everyone remained motionless, the statue suddenly stood up with its dangerous smile, making everyone feel very frightened and unsure of what to do next. Meanwhile, Ju-hee had to use all her magical power to heal Jin-woo. When they looked back at the battlefield, they realized that the situation was truly terrible. The leader took responsibility and accepted the consequences of his mistake in front of the group, but Jin-woo understood that this was not the time for people to argue. Jin-hoo, who had read many mythological stories, realized that the object summoned from under the ground by the statue could be an altar. The third rule was to believe in the deity, so someone in the group aimed a sword at the leader and forced him to take responsibility as he had just said. Although this action was highly condemned, the leader accepted it and went to the altar alone. Arriving at the altar, a fire was lit, astonishing everyone. Jin-goo had asked 2 people to escort him to the altar, but as the 3 of them stepped in, 3 other fires were also lit. Jin-woo couldn't understand this phenomenon, but according to the leader, the gate had been open for a week. Jin-woo remembered that after 7 days, the gate would fully open, leading to the dungeon explosion phenomenon, when the monsters would escape. As the stone statues approached the altar, everyone began to feel anxious. Jin-hoo thought it might be a children's game, but Jin-woo reminded everyone not to take their eyes off the statue. However, a girl couldn't bear the fear and ran outside, causing the door to close. Jin-woo realized that perhaps the statue was testing the group to continue to believe in the deity. Although another person couldn't bear it and left, Jin-woo still held on to hope to survive. When the stone statue was about to finish Jin-woo, a system message appeared indicating that a hidden mission had been completed, and Jin-woo was qualified to become an awakened player. Jin-woo woke up in a hospital and remembered everything that had happened in the dungeon. Jin-woo was also very surprised to find that his limbs had recovered as before, even all the wounds on his body had healed as if nothing had happened. At this point, 2 men from the monitoring department of the Hunter Association came to visit Jin-woo, making him very curious about why they had come. First, they announced that Jin-woo had been in a coma for 3 days. Meanwhile, the leader had lost an arm and would have to retire, and the girl Ju-hee was being treated for a major shock. They didn't know if Ju-hee could return as a hunter anymore. Jin-woo remembered that everyone had just experienced very horrifying events, and only 6 people returned alive from the ghost dungeon. After receiving reports from the survivors, the White Tiger Guild came to the dungeon. Jin-woo was still unconscious there, but they found no traces of the stone statues or the altar. However, due to consistent testimonies from witnesses, they believed that everything had indeed happened. They suspected that Jin-woo might have woken up after awakening. Jin-woo silently rejoiced at the thought that he might be like other hunters in the guild. However, when measuring mana, Jin-woo only scored 10 points, making him feel disappointed as he was now weaker than even E-rank. Jin-woo knew that the system board was only visible to him and operated according to his requests. In addition, Hein's father was assigned the task of guiding new recruits on the dungeon raid. Although it was not suitable for this role, Hein's father still had to accept and just fight to lead others. In another situation, a gate suddenly appeared, causing the people to expect hunters to come and solve it. However, the system board began to punish Jin-woo for not completing the mission, sending him to another space to face the challenge of a giant centipede. Jin-woo had to run to survive within the specified time. After a while of exhausting running, Jin-woo touched the limit of luck when the centipede was about to attack, but the punishment time ended, so he was brought back to the hospital room. As compensation, Jin-woo would receive rewards after completing the previous punishment. A few days later, Jin-goo reported to his sister that he was recovering very quickly and would soon be discharged from the hospital. As for Ju-hee, after many days in the room, she received a mission from the Hunter Association to deal with a Grade D gate that had just appeared on the street. Meanwhile, they let Ju-hee know that Jin-woo had woken up and was discharged from the hospital, making Ju-hee feel very happy and grateful. Although Jin-woo had not completely healed, he still decided to accept the mission to test his ability. As Jin Woo recalled his weapons, he remembered the inventory within the system. When the wolf lunged at him, Jin Woo opened up his inventory and withdrew a sword. With just one well-aimed strike, he successfully dispatched the wolf. After a challenging battle, Jin Woo felt exhilarated by the strength he had gained. Despite facing numerous dangers, he felt himself growing stronger with each encounter, instilling a newfound confidence that he would truly become more powerful than before. After clearing out the wolf pack, Jin Woo obtained various items, including a teleportation stone. Although he understood that leaving now would deprive him of easy power-ups, he still stashed the stone in his inventory. Continuing his journey, Jin Woo sensed a formidable monster lurking below, making leveling up more challenging. However, Jin Woo remained undaunted and ready to face any challenge within the dungeon. Suddenly, a monster surged from the water, knocking Jin Woo back and shattering his sword. Before him stood a colossal serpent named the King, its swampy domain marked with ominous orange runes signifying its overwhelming power. Its tough hide rendered ordinary weapons ineffective against it. Jin Woo tried to evade, but he couldn't escape the serpent's tail swipe, sending him tumbling into the water. The monster relentlessly pummeled Jin Woo, even hurling train cars at him. Despite feeling weak, Jin Woo recalled the leader's advice and resolved to push himself further. The serpent continued its onslaught, leaving Jin Woo feeling ashamed of his own inadequacy. However, his determination kept him from giving up. Jin Woo managed to climb onto the serpent's back and search for an opportunity to strike. With increased muscle points, he clung tightly to the serpent's neck and ruptured its tough hide. Finally, after a grueling battle, Jin Woo emerged victorious over the monster.